Welcome to Moonlit Insomniac. Tonight we drift through the heart of Venice, where the air tastes of salt and spice, and the canals carry secrets older than time itself. Let young Marco Polo guide you through the awakening market stalls, where trade and destiny intertwine, and where an unexpected meeting with a mysterious young woman begins to stir something deeper. A quiet, timeless love between dream and daylight. As the scent of cinnamon and jasmine fills the night, allow Venice to wrap around you like silk. So settle in, breathe softly, and let the romance of old Venice drift through your dreams. Chapter 1. The Apprentice's Dawn. The first light of dawn touched the waters of the Grand Canal with fingers of rose and gold, painting the ancient stones of Venice in soft, dreamy hues. In the narrow canal that wound between weathered buildings, a young boy of 15 moved through the misty morning, his footsteps echoing gently against the cobblestones. This was Marco, son of Niccolo Polo, and though he did not yet know it, his name would one day be whispered in wonder throughout the civilized world. But on this gentle morning, Marco was simply an apprentice, carrying a woven basket that smelled faintly of yesterday's bread and the promise of today's adventures. The Rialto market lay ahead, awakening like a sleeping giant as merchants and vendors prepared their stalls for another day of gentle commerce. The sound of wooden shutters opening mixed with the soft lapping of water against stone, creating a melody that had sung through these streets for centuries. Marco paused at the edge of the market square, watching as the familiar magic unfolded. Here, in this ancient place where East met West in the most peaceful of exchanges, the world seemed to hold its breath. The great wooden stalls, some painted in faded blues and greens, others bearing the honest patina of countless hands, stood like faithful sentinels guarding secrets that stretched back to the time of emperors and silk roads. A soft breeze carried the scent of the sea mixed with exotic spices, cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from Malabar, saffron from Persia. These fragrances had traveled farther than most people could imagine, crossing deserts and mountains, sailing across vast oceans, all to find their resting place here in this sacred space of trade. Marco breathed deeply, feeling the familiar comfort that these morning rituals always brought him. "Buongiorno, Giovane Marco," called a gentle voice from behind a display of early spring vegetables. It was old Alberto, the herb merchant whose family had tended these same stalls for 7 generations. His weathered hands moved with surprising grace as he arranged bundles of fresh basil, rosemary, and wild hops that had been gathered from the lagoon islands just hours before. "Your master awaits you at the spice stall today. The caravans from the east have brought rare treasures." Marco nodded respectfully, feeling the familiar flutter of excitement in his chest. The spice merchants were the aristocracy of the market, guardians of secrets that could transform simple food into poetry and heal the most stubborn ailments. Their stalls were places of wonder, where peppercorns, worth more than their weight in gold, were weighed with the precision of jewelers, and where the air itself seemed to shimmer with possibility. As Marco made his way through the awakening market, he observed the gentle choreography that had been perfected over centuries. The fishmongers, their aprons already stained with the morning's catch, called out their wares in voices that somehow managed to be both enthusiastic and soothing. "Pesce fresco," fresh fish from the lagoon. Their voices rose and fell, like the very tides that had brought their treasures to shore. The fruit vendors created pyramids of color that would have made the painters of Byzantium weep with envy. Golden peaches caught the morning light alongside deep purple figs, while clusters of grapes, still bearing the morning dew, hung like precious amulets. Each piece of fruit was positioned with the care of a curator, arranging artifacts in a museum, because in truth, that's what these stalls were, living museums of nature's artistry. Marco's destination lay at the heart of the market, where the most valuable goods changed hands. The spice stall of Master Giovanni stood like a temple of aromatic mysteries, its wooden shelves lined with ceramic jars bearing labels in languages that Marco was only beginning to understand. The old merchant himself was a study in contrasts. His hands bore the calluses of hard work, yet his movements possessed the grace of a scholar. His eyes, dark as the finest Ethiopian coffee beans he sometimes traded, missed nothing. "Ah, Marco," Master Giovanni said without looking up from his ledger. "I see you bring the morning bread from Maria. Good. We shall break our fast together, and then you shall learn the most important lesson of our trade. The art of listening to what spices whisper when they think no one is paying attention." The apprentice settled onto a low wooden stool, watching as his master moved among the jars with the familiarity of a father among his children. Each container held not just commodities, but stories. The cinnamon bark from Ceylon carried tales of monsoon rains and ancient kingdoms. The cardamom pods from the Malabar coast whispered of elephant trails and temple ceremonies. The precious saffron threads from Persia sang of desert caravans and royal feasts. "You see, Marco," Master Giovanni continued, his voice taking on the dreamy quality that came over him when he spoke of his beloved trade, "every spice has its own personality, its own preferences. Some, like pepper, are bold and demanding. Others, like vanilla, are shy and must be coaxed to reveal their secrets. Our job is not merely to buy and sell, but to understand these personalities, to become friends with each fragment of distant lands." As the morning progressed, Marco learned to identify spices by their scent alone, to judge quality by texture and color, to understand the subtle signs that revealed whether a merchant spoke truthfully about their origins. But more than this, he learned the gentle art of patience. In the spice trade, haste was not just foolish, it was sacrilegious. Each transaction was a meditation, a dance of mutual respect between buyer and seller. The first customers of the day began to filter through the market. Housewives seeking ingredients for the evening meal, cooks from the great houses selecting provisions for their masters, apothecaries searching for medicinal herbs. Each interaction was a small ceremony, a reaffirmation of the bonds that held the community together. Marco watched his master work, noting how Master Giovanni never rushed a customer, never pushed a sale. Instead, he created space for decisions to ripen naturally, like fruit in the sun. When a young woman approached seeking pepper for her father's name-day feast, the old merchant spent 10 minutes discussing the merits of different varieties, suggesting combinations that would honor both the occasion and the family's modest means. "Remember, Marco," Master Giovanni said during a quiet moment, "we are not merely merchants. We are custodians of tradition, keepers of the gentle flame that has burned in this market for 1,000 years. Every fair transaction, every honest weight, every kind word adds another layer to the foundation upon which Venice stands." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows between the stalls. The market reached its daily crescendo, a symphony of voices, scents, and colors that somehow managed to be both energetic and soothing. Children weaved between the adults' legs, their laughter adding a lighter note to the deeper melodies of commerce. Old friends met and exchanged news while examining the day's offerings, their conversations flowing as naturally as the canals that surrounded them. Marco found himself falling into the rhythm of the day, his movements becoming as fluid as those of the veteran merchants around him. He learned to wrap parcels in brown paper tied with string, to write receipts in the elegant script that was expected of all who worked in the Rialto, to calculate prices with the speed and accuracy that would one day serve him in the great bazaars of the East. But beyond these practical skills, something deeper was taking root in the young apprentice's heart. He was beginning to understand that the market was more than a place of business. It was a living entity, a creature of habit and tradition that thrived on the gentle interactions of its denizens. Each stall was a cell in this larger organism, each merchant a specialized function that contributed to the health of the whole. As noon approached and the market began its gentle wind-down, Marco helped his master secure the precious spices in their locked cabinets. The ritual was performed with the same care a priest might show in putting away sacred vessels after a service. Each jar was cleaned, its label checked, its contents verified before being placed in its designated spot. "You did well today, young Marco," Master Giovanni said as they shared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and olives. "But tell me, what did you learn beyond the mechanics of our trade?" Marco thought carefully before answering. In Master Giovanni's world, quick answers were often wrong answers. "I learned that patience is not just a virtue in our trade, but the very foundation upon which all lasting relationships are built. I learned that every transaction is an opportunity to strengthen the fabric of our community. And I learned that even the smallest spice carries within it the essence of distant lands and ancient stories." The old merchant's eyes crinkled with approval. "Good. You begin to see with the eyes of a true Venetian merchant. But there is more, much more. Tomorrow we shall explore the fish market, where the tides themselves teach lessons about the cycles of life and commerce. For now, rest. The afternoon is yours to wander and wonder." As Marco made his way through the quieting market, he felt a deep sense of belonging. The stalls that had seemed so chaotic on his first day now revealed their hidden order. He understood the logic behind the arrangement of goods, the timing of deliveries, the subtle negotiations that occurred in glances and gestures rather than words. He paused at the edge of the Grand Canal, watching as the afternoon light transformed the water into a mirror of the sky. Gondolas glided past like thoughts across a peaceful mind, their oars creating ripples that spread outward in perfect circles. The city seemed to be breathing slowly, deeply, as if settling in for an afternoon nap. In the distance, the bells of San Marco began their daily song, a melody that had marked the passage of time for generations. Marco closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, feeling the vibrations deep in his chest. He thought of his father and uncle, far away in distant lands, and wondered what markets they might be exploring, what spices they might be smelling, what gentle negotiations they might be conducting. The breeze carried the scent of jasmine from some hidden garden, mixing with the salt air and the lingering aroma of morning coffee. Marco smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new lessons, new wonders, new opportunities to deepen his understanding of the ancient dance of commerce. For now, though, he was content to simply be a young apprentice in the greatest market in the world, surrounded by the gentle rhythms of a life that had been perfected over centuries. As he walked slowly homeward through the narrow streets, Marco carried with him the peace that comes from belonging to something greater than oneself. The market had claimed him as its own, and he had accepted the gift with an open heart. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, but today had been perfect in its quiet way. A day of gentle learning, peaceful commerce, and the subtle magic that lived in every corner of Venice's eternal marketplace. Chapter 2. The Spice Merchant's Daughter. The morning mist clung to Venice like a silk shawl, softening the edges of ancient buildings and turning the city into a dreamscape of water and stone. Marco made his way through the narrow calle, his footsteps muffled by the damp cobblestones, carrying with him the same woven basket that had become his constant companion. But today there was something different in the air, a subtle electricity that made the hairs on his arms rise with anticipation. As he approached the Rialto market, Marco noticed a new stall nestled between the familiar faces. The wooden structure bore the deep amber patina of well-traveled wood, and from its shelves drifted the most intoxicating blend of aromas he had ever encountered. It was here that he first saw her, arranging small brass containers with movements so graceful they seemed choreographed by angels. She was perhaps a year younger than Marco, with dark hair that caught the morning light and eyes the color of rich coffee. Her dress was simple but elegant, the deep blue fabric suggesting travels to distant lands where such dyes were commonplace. When she looked up and met his gaze, Marco felt something shift inside his chest, as if one of the market's ancient stones had suddenly decided to take up residence in his heart. "You're staring," she said, but her voice carried laughter rather than reproach. "Are you always so bold with strangers, or is it just the morning that has stolen your manners?" Marco felt heat rise to his cheeks. "Forgive me," he managed, bowing slightly in the Venetian manner. "I am Marco, apprentice to Master Giovanni of the spice stalls. I was admiring your arrangement. The way you've organized your goods shows great understanding of their nature." The girl's eyes sparkled with interest. "You understand spices, then?" "Most boys your age see only the colors and smells. They miss the stories." She stepped from behind her stall, and Marco noticed how she moved with the same fluid grace as the gondoliers who navigated the narrow canals. "I am Sophia, daughter of Master Rashid, who has lately come from Constantinople to establish his trade in Venice." "Constantinople?" Marco breathed the word like a prayer. "The city where East and West embrace like old friends. Your father must have seen wonders beyond imagining." Sophia smiled, and Marco thought it was like watching the sun rise over the lagoon. "He has stories that would keep you awake for 100 nights. But come, let me show you something that will demonstrate whether you truly understand spices, or if you are merely being polite." She led him to her stall, where dozens of small containers held treasures that made Marco's head spin with their complexity. Sophia selected a small wooden box carved with intricate patterns that suggested Arabic calligraphy. "Close your eyes," she instructed, and when Marco complied, she opened the box and let him breathe in its contents. The scent was like nothing Marco had ever experienced, warm and cool simultaneously, carrying hints of vanilla and mystery, with undertones that seemed to whisper of distant markets and moonlit gardens. It was both familiar and utterly foreign, like a memory from a dream he couldn't quite recall. "Cardamom," Sophia said softly. "But not just any cardamom. These pods were harvested in the highlands of Malabar, where the air is so pure that even the monkeys speak in whispers. They were dried in the shade of temple walls, where prayers have been offered for 1,000 years. Can you taste the difference?" Marco opened his eyes to find Sophia watching him with an expression of gentle challenge. He took one of the pale green pods from her palm, noting how it seemed to pulse with its own inner light. When he crushed it between his fingers, the aroma intensified, and he understood what she meant about stories. This wasn't merely a spice. It was a vessel carrying the essence of a place and time that existed far beyond the borders of Venice. "It speaks of rainforests and ancient wisdom," Marco said slowly, trying to find words for sensations that seemed to exist beyond language. "But there's something else. Something that reminds me of home, though I've never been to Malabar." Sophia's smile deepened. "You do understand. My father says that the best spices carry within them the memory of every hand that has touched them, every market where they have been displayed, every kitchen where they have worked their magic. They are like books written in scent rather than ink." As the morning progressed, Marco found himself drawn again and again to Sophia's stall. Between his duties with Master Giovanni, he would find excuses to pass by, sometimes to ask questions about exotic spices, sometimes simply to exchange smiles that seemed to carry more meaning than words could hold. Sophia proved to be as knowledgeable as she was beautiful. She taught Marco about the subtle differences between cinnamon from Ceylon and cassia from China, explaining how the true connoisseur could distinguish them by the way they curled and the complexity of their aroma. She showed him how to judge the quality of saffron by its color and the way it dissolved in warm water, revealing whether it had been properly dried or hastily processed. "In my father's country," she explained during a quiet moment, "we believe that spices have their own spirits. To use them properly, one must first make friends with these spirits, understand their moods and preferences. Some spices are shy and must be coaxed to reveal their gifts. Others are bold and will dominate a dish if not treated with respect." Marco listened with the attention he usually reserved for Master Giovanni's most important lessons. But where his master spoke of commerce and practical matters, Sophia spoke of relationships and understanding. She made the spices seem like living creatures with their own desires and personalities. "Show me," Marco asked during a lull in customers. "Show me how to make friends with a spice." Sophia selected a small jar containing what looked like tiny tree bark curls. "This is true cinnamon, from the inner bark of trees that grow in the highlands of Ceylon. The Dutch have made it difficult to obtain, which makes each piece precious. But the cinnamon doesn't care about politics or prices. It only wants to be understood." She placed a small piece in Marco's palm and guided his fingers to crush it gently. "Don't rush. Let it tell you its story. Where has it been? What has it seen? The cinnamon trees grow for 20 years before they are ready to give up their bark. Each ring in the wood represents a season of rain and sun, of storms and calm. Can you feel the patience in the spice?" Marco closed his eyes and tried to sense what Sophia was describing. Gradually, he began to understand. The cinnamon did seem to carry a sense of time and patience, a wisdom that came from growing slowly in perfect conditions. When he opened his eyes, Sophia was nodding approvingly. "You see? This is why I love the market. Every day brings new people to meet, new stories to discover. But more than that, it brings opportunities to share the wisdom of distant places. Your master Giovanni understands this too, though he expresses it differently." The morning flowed into afternoon like wine poured from an ancient vessel. Customers came and went, some seeking specific spices for medicinal purposes, others browsing for culinary adventures. Sophia treated each person with the same gentle patience, whether they were wealthy merchants seeking rare saffron, or poor women looking for a pinch of pepper to flavor their family's evening meal. Marco noticed how she had inherited her father's gift for making each customer feel valued. She would ask about their families, remember their preferences from previous visits, and sometimes include small samples of new spices with their purchases. "A gift for a friend," she would say, and Marco could see how this generosity created bonds that would bring customers back again and again. During the quiet moments between customers, Sophia shared stories of her journey from Constantinople. She spoke of the great markets there, where merchants from India, Persia, and Arabia gathered to trade goods that had traveled halfway around the world. She described the grand bazaar with its thousands of shops, the air thick with the scent of 1,000 spices, the sound of a dozen languages creating a symphony of commerce. "Venice is different," she observed. "Here the market feels more intimate. In Constantinople, everything is grand and overwhelming. Here there is time to breathe, to appreciate each transaction as something special." Marco understood what she meant. The Rialto market, for all its importance, maintained a human scale that made every interaction feel personal. Even the wealthiest merchants took time to exchange pleasantries, to inquire about families, to share news from distant ports. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Sophia began the ritual of closing her stall. Each container was carefully sealed, its contents protected from the damp Venetian air. The more valuable spices were locked away in wooden cabinets that bore the marks of many journeys. Everything was done with the same methodical care that Marco had learned from Master Giovanni. "Would you—" Marco began, then paused. uncertain how to continue. "Would I what?" Sophia asked, not looking up from her work, but smiling in a way that suggested she knew exactly what he was trying to ask. "Would you like to walk with me tomorrow morning? I could show you the fish market at dawn before the crowds arrive. The fishermen bring in their catch, and for a little while the whole market belongs to those who truly understand its rhythms." Sophia looked at him then, her dark eyes serious but kind. "I would like that very much. My father says that to understand a city's soul, one must see it at dawn, when it thinks no one is watching." They arranged to meet at the edge of the fish market, just as the first boats were returning with their night's work. Marco felt as if he were floating as he made his way home through the evening streets. The city seemed transformed, its familiar contours now charged with new possibility. That night, Marco lay in his narrow bed, listening to the gentle sounds of Venice settling into sleep. The occasional splash of an oar, the distant singing of a gondolier, the soft creaking of ancient wood, all seemed to be conspiring to create a lullaby of contentment. He thought of Sophia's eyes, her graceful hands, the way she made the ancient art of spice trading seem like poetry. Tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new conversations, new opportunities to explore the mysterious connection that had formed between them so quickly. But for now, Marco was content to drift into sleep, surrounded by the gentle rhythms of a city that had been making matches and fostering friendships for longer than memory could trace. In his dreams, he walked through markets where spices sang their ancient songs, and beautiful girls with dark eyes taught him the language of distant lands. It was a good dream, the kind that leaves the dreamer smiling even after waking, and it carried him gently through the night toward a dawn that promised wonders yet undiscovered. The market, in its infinite wisdom, had brought together two young hearts that beat in rhythm with its eternal commerce. And in that gentle coming together, it had created something more valuable than any spice or silk, the beginning of a friendship that would color both their lives with the warm, golden glow of possibility. Chapter 3. Whispered Legends of the Silk Road. The evening settled over Venice like a velvet curtain, bringing with it the gentle hush that followed the market's daily symphony. Marco sat with Sophia on the stone steps of a small bridge that arched over one of the city's countless canals, their feet dangling above water that reflected the first stars like scattered diamonds. The day's commerce had ended, but the real magic of Venice was just beginning to unfold. "Tell me about the Silk Road," Marco said softly, not wanting to disturb the evening's peaceful spell. "Your father must have shared stories of the great caravans that travel between east and west." Sophia's eyes took on a distant look, as if she were gazing through the walls of buildings and across vast distances. "The Silk Road is not just one road," she began, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a storyteller. "It is a web of paths that connects the world like threads in an enormous tapestry. Some routes cross mountains so high that eagles fly below the passes. Others stretch across deserts where the sand sings in the wind." She paused to listen to the gentle lapping of water against the bridge's foundations. "My father traveled part of the road when he was young. He says that every stone along the way has been polished smooth by the feet of merchants, pilgrims, and adventurers. Some of those stones have witnessed the passage of silk worth more than its weight in gold, spices that could purchase kingdoms, and ideas that would change the world." Marco leaned back against the cool stone, letting Sophia's words paint pictures in his mind. "What kinds of ideas?" "Ideas about how to navigate by the stars, how to preserve food for long journeys, how to communicate with people who speak different languages, but also stories, tales of heroes and monsters, of love and betrayal, of kingdoms that rose and fell like the tides. The Silk Road carries not just goods, but dreams." A gondola glided past beneath them, its oar creating ripples that caught the lantern light like liquid fire. The gondolier sang softly in Venetian dialect, his voice carrying across the water like a blessing. My father says that Venice is where all the threads of the Silk Road come together, Sophia continued. Here in our markets, you can find goods that have traveled farther than most people will ever journey in their lifetimes. Each item carries within it the memory of its journey, the heat of desert suns, the cold of mountain passes, the salt spray of ocean crossings. Marco thought about this, considering the spices he had been learning about. Is that why some spices seem to have personalities? Because they've absorbed something from all the places they've been? Sophia smiled in the gathering darkness. Exactly. My grandmother used to say that well-traveled spices are like wise old people. They've seen so much that they've learned patience and understanding. They know that their journey is as important as their destination. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of Venice. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour, its bronze voice rolling across the rooftops like a gentle wave. The city seemed to be settling into its nighttime rhythm, the frantic energy of daylight giving way to a more contemplative mood. Tell me about your father's journey, Marco requested, sensing that Sophia had more stories to share. He left Constantinople when he was not much older than we are now, Sophia began, her voice soft as silk. He joined a caravan that was traveling to Samarkand, the great city that sits at the crossroads of the world. The journey took months, crossing mountains and deserts, passing through lands controlled by different rulers, each with their own customs and languages. She wrapped her shawl more tightly around her shoulders, though the evening was not cold. In Samarkand, he met merchants from China who carried silk so fine that it could be drawn through a ring. They told him about the great Khan who ruled over lands more vast than any European king could imagine. They spoke of cities with populations larger than entire countries, of inventions that seemed like magic to Western minds. Did your father go to China? Marco asked, his imagination already traveling along the route Sophia described. No, that journey was beyond his means and courage at the time, but he met those who had made the trip, and their stories burned in his memory like candles in a dark room. They spoke of the Khan's palace, where walls were covered in silk and servants carried purses of gold dust to scatter before their master's feet. They described markets where goods from every corner of the known world could be found, where languages mixed like colors in a painter's palette. A soft splash made them look down to see a cat drinking from the canal, its reflection creating a perfect mirror image in the still water. The animal looked up at them with golden eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, then continued its drink with feline dignity. But the most precious cargo the Silk Road carries, Sophia said, returning to her story, is not silk or spices or precious stones. It is knowledge. Every merchant who travels those roads learns something new, about navigation, about medicine, about mathematics, about the world itself. And when they return home, they bring that knowledge with them, sharing it in markets like ours. Marco nodded, understanding dawning. That's why Master Giovanni is always asking traveling merchants about their journeys. He's not just making conversation, he's gathering knowledge. Exactly. In my father's shop in Constantinople, we had visitors from India who taught us about the medicinal properties of turmeric, from China who showed us how to preserve ginger in syrup, from Arabia who shared the secrets of combining spices to create flavors greater than the sum of their parts. Each visitor was like a book written in flesh rather than paper. The moon had begun its journey across the sky, casting silver pathways across the water. Venice at night was a different creature than Venice by day, quieter, more mysterious, as if the city were sharing secrets that daylight was too harsh to reveal. My father says that the greatest merchants are those who understand that they're not just traders in goods, but traders in connections, Sophia continued. Every relationship they build, every story they share, every bit of knowledge they gather becomes part of a great web that spans the world. She turned to face Marco directly, her eyes catching the moonlight. That's what I want to do, become a weaver of connections, someone who helps different worlds understand each other through the language of trade. Marco felt a kinship with Sophia that went deeper than their shared interest in spices. They were both apprentices, not just to their respective masters, but to the great mystery of commerce that had been unfolding for centuries. They were learning to be bridges between worlds, translators of needs and desires, facilitators of dreams. "My father and uncle are traveling merchants," Marco said, realizing that he had found someone who might understand the mixture of pride and worry that came with having family members who journeyed to distant lands. "They've been gone for many months, traveling in parts of the world I've only heard about in stories." Sophia's expression softened with understanding. "It must be difficult, not knowing where they are or when they might return. But think of the knowledge they're gathering, the connections they're building. When they come home, they'll bring the world back with them in their stories and their goods." "That's what my mother says," Marco agreed. "She says that every time they return, it's like watching Venice grow larger, as if the city expands to hold all the places they've been." They talked long into the evening, sharing dreams and fears, hopes and ambitions. Sophia spoke of her desire to one day travel the Silk Road herself, to see the places she had only heard about in stories. Marco confessed his own growing restlessness, his sense that Venice, wonderful as it was, might not be able to contain all the curiosity that burned within him. "But for now," Sophia said eventually, rising from her seat on the bridge, "we have the market. We have the spices and the stories they carry. We have the wisdom of masters who have devoted their lives to understanding the gentle art of trade. And we have each other to share the journey with." They walked together through the quiet streets, their footsteps echoing softly against ancient stones. Venice at night was a city of shadows and whispers, where every corner might conceal a piece of history, where every canal might hide a story waiting to be discovered. At the door of Sophia's temporary lodgings, they paused. The building was modest but well-maintained, the kind of place that respectable merchants might rent while establishing their trade in the city. "Tomorrow," Sophia said, "I'll show you something special. My father has a spice that even Master Giovanni has never seen, a gift from a merchant who traveled to the islands beyond India. But only if you promise to keep an open mind and let it tell you its story." Marco promised readily, knowing that Sophia's surprises were always worth the wait. As he made his way home through the sleeping city, he felt as if he were walking through a storybook where every page revealed new wonders. The Silk Road, which had seemed like a distant fantasy, was now a living presence in his life, brought to him through Sophia's stories and her father's spices. That night, Marco dreamed of caravans winding through starlit deserts, of merchants sharing stories around campfires, of spices that carried within them the memory of every step of their journey. He dreamed of Sophia walking beside him on those distant roads, her eyes bright with the same wonder that filled his own heart. The market had given him many gifts, knowledge, purpose, a sense of belonging. But Sophia was perhaps the greatest gift of all, a companion who shared his dreams, who understood the call of distant horizons, who made the ordinary business of trade seem like the greatest adventure in the world. As Venice settled into its ancient sleep, Marco drifted into dreams where the Silk Road led not just to distant lands, but to a future filled with possibility, companionship, and the gentle wisdom that comes from understanding that every journey begins with a single step, and every great adventure starts with curiosity and an open heart. Chapter 5. Secrets of the Lagoon Harvest. The seasons had turned since Marco's first day as an apprentice, and spring had painted Venice in shades of renewal. The morning air carried the sweet scent of blossoming trees mixed with the familiar salt tang of the lagoon, creating a perfume that existed nowhere else in the world. Marco walked with Sophia along a path that led away from the bustling market, toward the edges of the city where Venice met its natural foundation. "Today," Sophia announced with the excitement of someone sharing a precious secret, "you'll learn about the other half of our trade, the gifts that come not from distant lands, but from the waters and islands that surround us. My father says that to be a complete merchant, one must understand both what comes from afar and what grows at home." They had taken a small boat across the lagoon to Sant'Erasmo, the largest island in the Venetian archipelago and the market garden of the city. As they approached, Marco could see why the island was so valued. Fields of vegetables stretched in orderly rows, orchards heavy with fruit trees, and gardens that produced herbs and flowers for both culinary and medicinal purposes. Their guide was an elderly woman named Lucia, whose family had been tending these lands for more generations than anyone could count. She moved through the gardens with the familiarity of someone walking through her own memories, touching plants with hands that seemed to communicate directly with the soil. "The lagoon provides," Lucia explained as she showed them beds of castrara, the tiny artichokes that were a Venetian delicacy, "but she demands respect and understanding. These plants, they know the rhythm of the tides, the taste of the salt air, the moods of the water that surrounds them. You cannot force them to grow according to your schedule. You must learn to dance with their natural timing." Marco watched as she demonstrated the proper technique for harvesting the artichokes, cutting them with a curved knife that looked like it had been designed specifically for this purpose. Each cut was precise, respectful, as if she were taking a gift rather than claiming a possession. "We start our days before the sun rises," Lucia continued, leading them through rows of vegetables that seemed to glow with inner health. "The plants are most giving in the early morning, when the dew still holds the memory of the night. By midday, they retreat into themselves, conserving their strength for the next dawn. They move through gardens that produce some of Venice's most prized ingredients, purple asparagus that appeared in spring markets like jewels, Radicchio di Treviso with its distinctive bittersweet flavor, and delicate herbs that grew only in the unique microclimate of the lagoon islands. Every island has its own personality," Lucia explained as they rested in the shade of a fig tree. "Sant'Erasmo is our mother, providing the staples that feed the city. But Murano gives us the fish that have made our cuisine famous. Murano provides not just glass, but the salt from its salt works that preserves our food and flavors our bread. Torcello, ancient as it is, still produces honey from bees that have fed on flowers, no longer found anywhere else in the world." Sophia listened with the attention of someone hearing familiar stories told by a master storyteller. "My father says that the lagoon is like a great merchant's warehouse, but one that restocks itself according to seasons and tides, rather than caravans and ships." Lucia smiled at this comparison. "Your father is wise. The lagoon is indeed our greatest supplier, but she is also our most demanding partner. She gives generously, but she expects us to understand her ways, to work with her rhythms rather than against them." They spent the morning learning the subtle art of lagoon harvesting. Marco discovered that picking herbs was not simply a matter of cutting what looked good, but of understanding which plants were at their peak, which could benefit from selective harvesting, and which should be left to complete their natural cycle. Lucia taught him to read the signs that plants gave, the slight change in leaf color that indicated perfect timing, the firmness of a fruit that revealed its readiness, the subtle scents that spoke of maturity and flavor. "The market merchants who understand these things," Lucia said as they gathered bundles of herbs for the afternoon boat back to Venice, "are the ones who command the highest prices and the most loyal customers. Anyone can sell vegetables, but only those who truly understand the lagoon can offer the experience of tasting Venice itself. They shared a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and vegetables so fresh they still held the morning sun. Lucia produced a bottle of wine made from grapes grown on the island, its flavor carrying hints of salt and minerals that spoke of its origins. "This," she said, raising her glass in a toast, "is the taste of place. When you drink this wine, you are drinking the soil of Sant'Erasmo, the air of the lagoon, the work of hands that understand the ancient partnership between farmer and land." As they prepared to leave, Lucia pressed small packets of seeds into their hands. "For your gardens," she said. "But remember, these seeds carry the memory of their home. They will grow best if you remember to treat them with the same respect we show them here." The boat ride back to Venice was peaceful, the afternoon sun painting the water in shades of gold and amber. Sophia sat in the bow, her dark hair streaming in the breeze, looking like a figurehead carved by a master artist. Marco found himself thinking about how much his understanding of trade had expanded since meeting her. "Your father was right," he said as Venice grew larger before them. "Understanding both the local and the exotic is essential. The spices from distant lands gain meaning when you understand the local ingredients they enhance. The herbs from our lagoon take on new significance when you appreciate the global trade networks that bring them to market." Sophia nodded. "It's all connected. The silk from China is beautiful, but it becomes magical when it's traded for glass from Murano, creating a connection that spans continents. The pepper from India gains new dimensions when combined with herbs from Sant'Erasmo, creating flavors that could exist nowhere else." They returned to the market as the afternoon trade was reaching its peak. Master Giovanni looked up from a customer as they approached, his experienced eye immediately noting the bundles of fresh herbs and vegetables they carried. "Ah, you've been to the islands," he said with approval. "Good. Now you understand that our trade is not just about what comes from afar, but about what grows in our own backyard. A merchant who understands only imports is like a cook who knows only one recipe, limited and ultimately unsatisfying." He examined their harvest with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades learning to judge quality. "Lucia's work, unless I miss my guess. She has the touch. Everything she grows seems to carry a little extra life force." "She taught us about timing," Marco reported, "about reading the plants, understanding their rhythms, working with rather than against their nature." "Important lessons," Master Giovanni agreed, "but there's more to learn. Tomorrow I'll take you to the salt works. Salt is Venice's oldest treasure, the foundation upon which much of our wealth was built. Understanding salt means understanding the very soul of our republic." As the day progressed, Marco found himself seeing the market with new eyes. The bundles of herbs from Sant'Erasmo that he had previously overlooked now seemed precious, carrying within them the essence of the lagoon and the wisdom of generations of farmers. The fish from the surrounding waters, which he had taken for granted, revealed themselves as products of the unique ecosystem that Venice had been built upon. Sophia appeared at his side as he was helping Master Giovanni prepare for the evening rush. "My father wants to meet you," she said quietly. "He was impressed by your understanding of the cardamom, and he's heard good things about your work with Master Giovanni. Would you come to our lodging this evening?" Marco felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Meeting Sophia's father would be like taking an examination in the art of merchant diplomacy. But it was also an opportunity to learn from someone who had successfully navigated the complex world of international trade. That evening, Marco found himself in a modest but comfortable apartment above a shop near the Rialto. Master Rashid was a man in his 50s, his beard carefully groomed, his eyes sharp with intelligence but kind with experience. He welcomed Marco with the formal courtesy of someone who understood the importance of first impressions. "So, young Marco," he said after they had exchanged pleasantries over tea that carried the distinctive flavor of Constantinople. "My daughter tells me you are learning the deeper meanings of our trade. Tell me, what have you learned about the relationship between local and exotic goods?" Marco thought carefully before responding. "I've learned that they complement each other, that each gains meaning from the other. Local goods ground us in place and tradition, while exotic goods connect us to the wider world. Together, they create something greater than either could be alone." Master Rashid nodded approvingly. "Good. And what have you learned about timing?" "That timing is everything in our trade. The right goods at the wrong time are worthless, but the right goods at the right time are beyond price. This applies not just to market conditions, but to the natural rhythms of growth and harvest, of supply and demand, of human needs and desires." The older merchant's eyes twinkled with satisfaction. "You have been paying attention. Sophia was right about you. Tell me, what do you think about partnerships between merchants from different traditions?" Marco recognized this as the heart of the conversation. "I think that the best partnerships are those that respect different traditions while creating something new. Master Giovanni and I have been learning from each other. I bring fresh eyes and new enthusiasm. He brings wisdom and experience. Together, we achieve more than either could alone." Master Rashid leaned back in his chair, studying Marco with the careful attention of a merchant assessing a valuable commodity. "You speak wisely for one so young. But tell me, what do you know of the risks of international trade?" "I know that every journey carries risks, storms, pirates, political upheaval, changes in demand. But I also know that without risk, there is no reward. The key is to understand the risks, to prepare for them, to build relationships that can help navigate difficult times." The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics that ranged from the practical aspects of international shipping to the philosophical underpinnings of cross-cultural trade. Master Rashid shared stories of his own experiences, of deals that had succeeded beyond expectation and others that had failed despite careful planning. "The most important lesson," he said as their meeting drew to a close, "is that trust is the most valuable commodity we trade in. Without trust, no amount of gold can ensure a successful partnership. With trust, even the most difficult challenges can be overcome." Walking home through the quiet streets, Marco felt as if he had passed some important test. He had been accepted into a fellowship that extended beyond the boundaries of Venice, a community of merchants who understood that trade was about more than profit. It was about connection, understanding, and mutual benefit. The secrets of the lagoon harvest were not just about plants and seasons, but about the deeper rhythms that governed all of life. Understanding these rhythms was the key to becoming not just a successful merchant, but a wise one. That night, Marco dreamed of gardens that spanned continents, of seeds that carried memories across oceans, of partnerships that transcended cultural boundaries. It was a peaceful dream, the kind that comes from knowing that he was learning the deeper truths that would serve him well in whatever adventures lay ahead. The market had given him many gifts, but perhaps the greatest was the understanding that everything was connected, the local and the exotic, the practical and the philosophical, the earth beneath his feet and the stars above his head. And in that connection lay not just the secret of successful trade, but the secret of a life well lived. Chapter 6. The Merchant's Code. The morning mist had not yet lifted from the canals when Marco found himself in the company of Venice's most respected merchants, gathered in a private room above the Rialto market. The chamber was simple but elegant, its walls lined with maps showing trade routes that spanned continents, its tables bearing ledgers that recorded fortunes made and lost in the great game of commerce. Master Giovanni had invited Marco to observe a meeting of the Merchants' Guild, a gathering where the city's traders discussed matters of mutual concern, from the fluctuating prices of spices to the political situations in distant lands that might affect their business. It was an honor usually reserved for established merchants, not apprentices. But Marco's growing understanding of the deeper principles of trade had earned him this opportunity. The men in the room represented the spectrum of Venetian commerce. There were spice merchants like Master Giovanni, silk traders who had built fortunes on the beautiful fabrics from the East, ship owners who commanded fleets that sailed to every port worth visiting, and bankers who provided the credit that made long-distance trade possible. Despite their different specialties, they shared a common understanding of the principles that govern their profession. The meeting was conducted with the same careful courtesy that Marco had observed in individual transactions, but on a larger scale. Each merchant spoke in turn, presenting information about market conditions, sharing intelligence about political developments, and proposing cooperative ventures that might benefit multiple parties. "The situation in Constantinople grows more unstable," reported a merchant who had just returned from the Byzantine capital. "The emperor's authority is weakening, and local governors are becoming more independent. This creates both opportunities and risks for our trade." A silk trader nodded gravely. "We must be careful not to extend too much credit to merchants in regions where political upheaval might prevent repayment. But we also don't want to miss opportunities that might arise from changing circumstances." The discussion that followed demonstrated the complexity of international trade in the medieval world. These merchants were not simply buyers and sellers, they were diplomats, intelligence gatherers, risk assessors, and strategic planners. Their decisions could affect not just their own fortunes, but the economic health of the entire republic. Marco listened with growing fascination as they discussed techniques for managing risk, methods for gathering reliable information about distant markets, and strategies for maintaining good relationships with foreign powers. It became clear that successful merchants needed to be as skilled in the arts of diplomacy and intelligence as they were in the mechanics of buying and selling. "Young Marco," Master Giovanni said during a break in the discussions, "you're seeing something that few apprentices ever witness. This is how the real business of Venice is conducted, not in the market stalls, but in rooms like this, where information is shared and strategies are developed. The individual transactions you see every day are just the visible tip of a very large iceberg." As the meeting continued, Marco began to understand the true nature of the merchant's code, the unwritten rules that governed their profession. It was a code based on trust, honor, and mutual respect. But it was also pragmatic and realistic about the challenges of conducting business across cultural and political boundaries. One merchant shared a story about a deal that had gone wrong due to a misunderstanding about local customs in a distant port. Rather than simply complaining about the loss, he used the experience to educate his colleagues about the importance of cultural understanding in international trade. "We must remember," he said, "that our way of doing business is not the only way. In some cultures, a direct approach is considered rude. In others, what we might see as dishonest bargaining is simply the expected way of conducting negotiations. Our job is not to judge these differences, but to understand and adapt to them." Another merchant spoke about the importance of maintaining good relationships, even with competitors. "A merchant who has no friends in the trade will not last long. Today he might be your competitor, but tomorrow he might be the only person who can help you when you're in trouble in a distant port." The meeting concluded with a discussion of a proposed joint venture. Several merchants pooling their resources to finance a large shipment of spices from India. The discussion was careful and detailed, with each participant ensuring that their interests were protected while also contributing to the common good. "This is how great enterprises are built," Master Giovanni explained to Marco afterward. "Not through the efforts of individual merchants, but through cooperation and mutual support. The risks are too great, and the distance is too vast for any one merchant to succeed alone. Walking back to the market, Marco felt as if he had been initiated into a secret society. He understood now that the merchant's code was not just about individual honesty and fair dealing. It was about creating a network of trust and cooperation that could span continents and overcome enormous obstacles. Later that day, Marco had the opportunity to see these principles in action when a crisis developed. A ship carrying valuable cargo for several different merchants had been delayed by storms, and there was concern that the goods might arrive too late for the seasonal markets. Rather than each merchant trying to solve the problem individually, they worked together to develop a solution. Some agreed to share warehouse space, others offered to help with the costs of expediting the cargo, and still others provided information about alternative markets where the goods might be sold if they missed the primary season. Marco watched in fascination as the merchants coordinated their efforts, each contributing what they could to solve a problem that affected them all. It was a practical demonstration of the principles he had observed in the morning meeting. "You see," Master Giovanni observed, "when merchants work together, they can overcome challenges that would defeat them individually. This is the real secret of our success, not just our individual skills, but our ability to cooperate for mutual benefit." That evening, Marco met Sofia at their usual bridge, eager to share what he had learned. She listened with growing interest as he described the meeting and the insights he had gained. "My father says the same things," she confirmed. "In Constantinople, the merchants have similar organizations. They understand that trade is not a zero-sum game where one person's gain must be another's loss. Instead, it's a collaborative enterprise where everyone can benefit from cooperation and mutual support." They sat in their customary spot, watching the evening traffic on the canal below. A wedding party passed by in a decorated gondola, the bride's white dress creating a momentary vision of purity against the dark water. The sound of singing drifted up to where they sat, adding another layer to the evening's peaceful soundtrack. "I've been thinking," Sophia said eventually, "about what you told me about your father and uncle. They must be living by the same code, building relationships and networks that will serve them well in their travels." Marco nodded, understanding more clearly now what his father and uncle were doing on their long journey. They weren't just buying and selling goods. They were building bridges between cultures, establishing relationships that would benefit not just themselves, but the entire Venetian trading community. "Do you think," Marco asked, "that the merchant's code could apply to other aspects of life? Not just business, but friendships, communities, even relationships between nations?" Sophia considered this thoughtfully. "I think it already does, whether we recognize it or not. The same principles that make for successful trade, trust, respect, understanding, cooperation, also make for successful human relationships. Maybe that's why merchants have often been the ones to bridge cultural divides. We've learned the skills that make such bridges possible." As the evening progressed, they found themselves discussing the future and their places in it. Both understood that their apprenticeships were preparing them for larger roles in the great drama of international commerce. But they also understood that success would require more than just technical knowledge of their trade. "I want to be the kind of merchant who makes the world smaller," Sophia said dreamily. "Not in the sense of making it less mysterious or wonderful, but in the sense of helping people understand each other better. When someone in Venice uses a spice from my father's homeland, they're participating in a relationship that spans continents. They're showing that despite our differences, we can appreciate and enjoy the same things." "And I want to be the kind of merchant who brings the world home," Marco responded, "who helps Venice understand that it's not just a city, but a crossroads where everything meets and everything is transformed. Every story I hear, every custom I learn about, every friendship I make, These are all treasures that I can share with my community." They talked until the stars had fully emerged and the city had settled into its nighttime rhythm. The conversation ranged from practical matters of trade to philosophical questions about the nature of commerce and human connection. It was the kind of conversation that could only happen between two young people who were beginning to understand the larger patterns that governed their world. As Marco walked home through the quiet streets, he carried with him a new understanding of what it meant to be a merchant. It wasn't just a profession or a way of making a living. It was a calling that required wisdom, patience, understanding, and a deep commitment to the principles that made human cooperation possible. The merchant's code was not just a set of rules for conducting business. It was a philosophy of life, a way of approaching the world that emphasized connection over division, cooperation over conflict, and mutual benefit over individual gain. It was a code that had been developed over centuries of trial and error, refined by countless merchants who had learned that the only sustainable success was that which benefited everyone involved. That night, Marco dreamed of networks that spanned the globe, connecting people and places in intricate patterns of mutual support and understanding. It was a beautiful vision, one that left him with a sense of purpose and possibility that would guide him through the years ahead. The market had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important was that every transaction was an opportunity to practice the art of human connection, every negotiation a chance to build bridges of understanding, every relationship a thread in the great tapestry of human cooperation that made civilization possible. It was a lesson that would serve him well, whether he remained in Venice or traveled to the distant lands that called to his adventurous spirit. Because wherever he went, he would carry with him the merchant's code, the understanding that trust was the most valuable commodity, that cooperation was the most profitable strategy, and that the greatest rewards came not from what you could take from others, but from what you could create together. Chapter 7. Dreams Beyond the Horizon. The winter had settled over Venice like a soft blanket, muting the city's usual vibrant colors and slowing its pace to match the season's contemplative mood. Marco sat by the hearth in Master Giovanni's private study, a room lined with books and maps that told the story of a lifetime spent in the great adventure of international trade. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere of intimacy and reflection that seemed perfect for the stories the old merchant was sharing. "Your father and uncle," Master Giovanni began, his voice taking on the dreamy quality it always assumed when he spoke of distant lands, "are walking in the footsteps of giants. Not just the merchants who have made Venice great, but the countless adventurers who have always been drawn to the unknown." He rose from his chair and moved to a large map that dominated one wall of the study. The parchment showed the known world in exquisite detail, with trade routes marked in different colors to indicate their relative safety and profitability. "Look here," he said, pointing to a route that wound through Central Asia. "This is the path your family is following, the same road that Marco Polo traveled 200 years ago." Marco studied the map with hungry eyes, trying to imagine the landscapes his father and uncle were traversing. The names alone were like poetry. Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, names that conjured images of domes and minarets, of bustling bazaars where goods from every corner of the world changed hands. "They've been gone for over a year now," Marco said softly, the familiar mixture of pride and worry settling in his chest. "Mother receives letters when they reach major cities, but the news is always months old by the time it reaches us. For all we know, they could be in China by now, or they could be facing dangers we can't even imagine." Master Giovanni returned to his chair, stoking the fire thoughtfully. The life of a traveling merchant is not an easy one, but it's a life that offers rewards beyond measure. Your father and uncle are not just seeking wealth, they're seeking knowledge, experience, understanding. They're becoming citizens of the world in a way that few people ever achieve. The old merchant reached for a small wooden box on the table beside him. From it, he produced a letter sealed with wax that bore an unfamiliar impression. This arrived today, forwarded through our network of merchants. It's from your father. Marco's heart leaped as he took the letter, breaking the seal with trembling fingers. The script was his father's familiar hand, but the words spoke of experiences that seemed almost fantastical. We have reached the court of the Ilkhan in Persia, the letter began. The wealth and sophistication we have encountered exceed anything we imagined. The Khan's palace makes our own Doge's residence seem modest by comparison. We have been welcomed as honored guests, and the Khan has shown great interest in the goods we have brought from Venice. The letter went on to describe markets filled with treasures from India and China, of diplomatic negotiations conducted with the grace of a chess match, of cultural exchanges that were enriching both sides. But it was the final paragraph that caught Marco's attention. We have heard stories of an even greater Khan who rules in the Far East, a ruler whose wealth and power surpass anything in the Western world. We are considering extending our journey to meet this great leader and establish trading relationships that could benefit Venice for generations to come. The risks are considerable, but the potential rewards are beyond calculation. Marco read the letter twice, his imagination soaring with the possibilities it contained. To travel to the court of the great Khan, to see the wonders of the East firsthand, to establish connections that could transform Venice's trading relationships. It was the stuff of dreams. They want to go to China, he said finally, looking up at Master Giovanni with wonder in his eyes. It would not be the first time Venetians have made such a journey, the old merchant replied. Your namesake, Marco Polo, opened that door 2 centuries ago. But it would be a bold undertaking, one that would require courage, patience, and no small amount of luck. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sophia entered, her cheeks flushed from the cold air, carrying a small package that she presented to Master Giovanni with a formal bow. From my father, she explained. He has received news from Constantinople that may be of interest to the guild. The news, when Master Giovanni had deciphered the coded message, was significant. The political situation in the Byzantine capital was becoming more unstable, with various factions competing for power and influence. This instability could affect trade routes that had been reliable for centuries. This is exactly the kind of intelligence that makes our network so valuable, Master Giovanni explained to Marco. A merchant working alone might not discover these developments until it was too late to adjust his plans. But by sharing information, we can all adapt to changing circumstances and minimize our risks. Sophia stayed for tea, and the conversation naturally turned to the subject of travel and adventure. She had her own dreams of seeing the world beyond Constantinople, of experiencing the cultures that she had only heard about in stories. My father says that every great merchant must make at least one long journey, she shared. Not just for the profit it might bring, but for the understanding it provides. Until you have seen how other people live, how they think, what they value, you cannot truly appreciate the complexity of our trade. Marco thought about this as he stared into the fire. His own dreams had been taking shape gradually, moving from vague wishes to concrete ambitions. The idea of following in his father's footsteps, of seeing the wonders of the East firsthand, was becoming more real with each passing day. Do you think, he asked Master Giovanni, that I might be ready for such a journey in a few years? The old merchant considered this carefully. You have learned much in your time as my apprentice. You understand the principles of our trade, the importance of relationships, the value of patience and respect. But there is still much to learn here in Venice before you venture into the wider world. He rose and moved to a bookshelf, selecting a volume that proved to be a collection of maps and travel narratives. However, there is no harm in beginning your education about the world beyond our lagoon. These accounts, written by merchants and travelers who have ventured far from home, can teach you much about the challenges and opportunities that await those with the courage to seek them. As the evening progressed, the conversation ranged from practical matters of international trade to philosophical questions about the nature of adventure and discovery. Master Giovanni shared stories of merchants who had achieved great success through courage and ingenuity, as well as cautionary tales of those who had failed due to hubris or poor preparation. The most successful travelers, he observed, are those who combine the courage to venture into the unknown with the wisdom to prepare carefully for the journey. They understand that adventure without preparation is foolishness, but preparation without adventure is stagnation. Sophia added her own perspective, drawing on her family's experiences in Constantinople and their connections to the wider world of Eastern trade. She spoke of the importance of cultural sensitivity, of learning local customs and languages, of building relationships that could provide support in difficult times. My father always says that a merchant traveling in foreign lands is like an ambassador for his entire community, she explained. How you behave, how you treat people, the relationships you build, these all reflect not just on you, but on Venice and all Venetian merchants. As the fire began to die down and the evening drew toward its close, Marco felt a sense of anticipation building within him. The world beyond Venice, which had once seemed like a distant fantasy, was becoming more real with each story, each map, each shared experience. Walking home through the quiet streets, Marco thought about the choices that lay ahead. He was happy in Venice, learning from Master Giovanni, building his understanding of the merchant's life, developing his relationship with Sophia. But he could feel the call of distant horizons growing stronger with each passing day. His mother was waiting for him when he arrived home, her eyes questioning but understanding. She had been the wife of a traveling merchant long enough to recognize the signs of wanderlust in her son. "You have the same look your father gets when he's planning a journey," she said gently. "The world is calling to you, isn't it?" Marco couldn't deny it. "Master Giovanni says I need more time to learn, to prepare. But I can feel it growing inside me. The desire to see the places I've only heard about, to experience the wonders that lie beyond our lagoon." His mother smiled with a mixture of pride and sadness. "Your father and I always knew this day would come. The son of Niccolo Polo was never going to be content with a quiet life in Venice. But promise me that when you go, you'll be as careful and wise as your father has learned to be." That night, Marco lay in his bed listening to the familiar sounds of Venice settling into sleep. But in his mind, he was already traveling the great roads of the world, crossing deserts and mountains, visiting cities whose names were like music, meeting people whose ways of thinking would expand his understanding of what it meant to be human. The dreams beyond the horizon were no longer just dreams. They were possibilities, destinations on a journey that would begin in Venice but would inevitably lead to the wider world. And with each day that passed, the call of that journey grew stronger, more insistent, more real. The market had taught him much, but it had also taught him that there were limits to what could be learned within the confines of a single city. True understanding would require venturing into the unknown, experiencing firsthand the wonders that lay beyond the horizon, and bringing back not just goods for trade, but knowledge and wisdom to share. It was a daunting prospect, but also an exciting one. The young apprentice who had started his journey with simple curiosity about the workings of the market was evolving into a future merchant adventurer, ready to take his place in the great tradition of Venetian explorers and traders. The dreams beyond the horizon were calling, and Marco knew that eventually he would have to answer. Chapter 8. The Language of Trade. The spring market was in full bloom, both literally and figuratively. The stalls overflowed with the season's bounty. Tender vegetables from Sant'Erasmo, early fruits from the mainland, and the familiar array of spices that connected Venice to the wider world. But for Marco, the most interesting development was the arrival of a merchant from a distant land, a man whose goods and manner of trade offered a glimpse into a culture vastly different from his own. The merchant's name was Ahmed, and he had traveled from Morocco with a cargo of goods that included not just the expected spices and textiles, but also items that Marco had never seen before. Intricate metalwork that seemed to capture light itself, leather goods that carried the scent of distant tanning processes, and ceramics whose glazes created colors that seemed to shift in different lights. What fascinated Marco most was Ahmed's approach to trade. Unlike the direct negotiations that were common in Venice, the Moroccan merchant conducted his business through a series of elaborate rituals that seemed to have as much to do with building relationships as with determining prices. "Watch carefully," Master Giovanni advised Marco as they observed Ahmed's first transaction of the day. "This is how trade is conducted in many parts of the world. The goods are important, but the relationship between buyer and seller is even more so." The customer was a wealthy Venetian lady seeking fabrics for her daughter's dowry. Rather than immediately displaying his wares, Ahmed began with an elaborate greeting that involved inquiries about her family, her health, and her general well-being. Only after several minutes of this social ritual did he begin to show his textiles, and even then, the discussion of price was postponed in favor of stories about the origins of the fabrics, the artisans who had created them, and the cultural significance of the patterns. Marco watched in fascination as the negotiation unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. There were moments of intense discussion, followed by periods of reflective silence, times when both parties seemed to be meditating on the deeper meaning of the transaction rather than simply haggling over price. In Ahmed's culture, Master Giovanni explained during a quiet moment, a business transaction is not just an exchange of goods for money. It's an exchange of respect, of stories, of cultural understanding. The price is important, but it's only one element in a much richer tapestry of meaning. As the day progressed, Marco had the opportunity to observe several of Ahmed's transactions, each one revealing new layers of the complex language of cross-cultural trade. The Moroccan merchant had an almost magical ability to make each customer feel that they were participating in something significant, that their purchase was not just a simple transaction, but an act of cultural bridge building. "You see," Ahmed explained to Marco during a break between customers, "in my country, we believe that every object carries the spirit of its maker and the essence of its origins. When I sell a piece of fabric, I am not just selling cloth. I am selling a piece of my culture, a fragment of my homeland, a story that will travel with the buyer and become part of their own story." This perspective was revolutionary to Marco, who had been learning trade as a practical business of supply and demand, quality and price. Ahmed was showing him that there was another dimension to commerce, one that operated on the level of meaning and connection, rather than just material exchange. Sophia appeared at midday, her curiosity piqued by the unusual merchant who had set up his stall near her father's. She watched Ahmed's technique with the same fascination that Marco had shown, recognizing in his approach elements that were familiar from her own cultural background. "In Constantinople," she told Marco quietly, "we have merchants from all over the world, each with their own way of conducting business. The Greeks are known for their philosophical approach to negotiation, the Armenians for their detailed contracts, the Arabs for their poetry and storytelling. Each tradition brings something valuable to the market." Ahmed overheard this comment and smiled with approval. "Your friend understands," he said to Marco. "The language of trade is not just about words and numbers. It's about understanding, about finding common ground between different ways of seeing the world." He gestured to his display of goods, each item carefully positioned to tell part of a larger story. Look at this pottery, for example. In my country, these patterns are not just decoration. They are prayers, blessings, wishes for the well-being of whoever uses the vessel. When I explain this to a customer, the object becomes more than just a container. It becomes a bridge between my culture and theirs. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers, and Marco observed how Ahmed adapted his approach to each person, while maintaining the essential elements of his cultural style. With some, he emphasized the practical qualities of his goods. With others, he focused on the aesthetic aspects, but always, he found a way to connect the transaction to something larger than simple commerce. The most successful merchants, Master Giovanni observed, are those who can speak multiple languages of trade. They understand that what works in Venice might not work in Constantinople, and what works in Constantinople might not work in Alexandria or Damascus. But they also understand that beneath all these differences, there are universal human needs and desires that can form the basis of understanding. As the day wore on, Marco found himself thinking about the different languages of trade he had been learning. There was the language of the Venetian market, with its emphasis on quality, reputation, and fair dealing. There was the language of international commerce, with its complex networks of credit, insurance, and risk management. And now there was this new language, one that spoke in terms of cultural exchange, mutual understanding, and shared meaning. Ahmed's final transaction of the day was with a fellow merchant, a Syrian trader who had been conducting business in Venice for several years. Their negotiation was conducted in a mixture of Arabic, Italian, and what Marco realized must be the universal language of merchants, a complex blend of gestures, expressions, and shared understanding that transcended linguistic barriers. "Watch this," Sophia whispered to Marco. "This is how experienced international merchants communicate. They speak a language that has been developed over centuries of cross-cultural trade." The negotiation between Ahmed and the Syrian merchant was a masterpiece of non-verbal communication. They used their hands to indicate quantities, their eyebrows to express approval or concern, their posture to signal willingness or reluctance. The actual words seemed almost secondary to the complex dance of gestures and expressions that conveyed the real meaning of their discussion. When the deal was concluded to mutual satisfaction, both merchants broke into broad smiles and embraced like old friends. It was clear that for them, the transaction had been not just successful, but enjoyable. A meeting of minds as well as a meeting of business interests. "That," Ahmed said afterward, turning to Marco and Sophia, "is how trade should be conducted. Not as a battle of wills, but as a collaboration between partners who respect each other and enjoy each other's company." As the market began to close for the day, Ahmed shared tea with Master Giovanni, Sophia, and Marco, conducting what he called the closing ceremony of the day's business. This was another aspect of the language of trade that Marco had never encountered. The ritual conclusion of the day's activities that included expressions of gratitude, hopes for future business, and blessings for safe travels. "In my tradition," Ahmed explained, "we believe that how you end something is as important as how you begin it. A proper closing ensures that tomorrow's opening will be successful. It also reminds us that we are part of a continuing story, not just isolated transactions." The conversation that followed ranged across topics that reflected the breadth of the merchant's world, from practical matters of shipping and insurance to philosophical questions about the role of trade in promoting understanding between cultures. Ahmed spoke of the great trading cities of the Islamic world, of the sophisticated commercial practices that had been developed over centuries, of the networks of trust and cooperation that connected merchants across vast distances. "We have a saying in my country," he shared as the evening drew to a close, A single candle can light 1,000 others without diminishing itself. This is how knowledge should be shared in the merchant community. When I teach you something about my way of trading, I don't lose that knowledge. I multiply it, creating new possibilities for understanding and cooperation. Walking home through the quiet streets, Marco found himself thinking about the different languages he was learning. Not just the spoken languages of different cultures, but the unspoken languages of trade, cooperation, and human connection. Each merchant he met, each cultural tradition he encountered, was adding new words and concepts to his growing vocabulary of commerce. Sophia appeared at his side as he crossed one of the city's many bridges, her timing suggesting that she had been waiting for him. "What did you think of Ahmed's approach?" she asked. "It was like watching a master musician perform," Marco replied. Every gesture, every word, every pause was perfectly timed to create a particular effect. But it wasn't manipulative. It was genuinely respectful, genuinely interested in creating understanding. "That's the key," Sophia agreed. "The best merchants don't just learn different languages of trade. They learn to speak from the heart in whatever language they're using. They understand that ultimately all trade is about human connection, about finding ways to meet each other's needs while respecting each other's dignity." They found their usual spot on the bridge and settled in to watch the evening traffic on the canal below. The city was transitioning from the energy of day to the peace of night, and the familiar rhythm was comforting even as Marco's mind raced with new possibilities. "Do you think," he asked Sophia, "that we could become masters of the language of trade, that we could learn to speak all these different dialects of commerce and cooperation?" "I think we already are," she replied with a smile. "Every day we spend in the market, every merchant we meet, every transaction we observe or participate in, we're learning the vocabulary, the grammar, the syntax of human cooperation. But more importantly, we're learning to understand what lies beneath all these different languages, the universal human desires for respect, for fairness, for connection." The conversation continued late into the evening, covering topics that ranged from the practical aspects of international trade to the philosophical implications of a world where different cultures could meet and exchange not just goods, but ideas, stories, and understanding. As Marco finally made his way home, he realized that he had learned something profound that day. The language of trade was not just about words and gestures, prices and quantities. It was about the fundamental human need to connect with others, to understand and be understood, to find common ground despite differences in culture, language, and tradition. It was a language that he was still learning, but he was beginning to understand its basic grammar: respect for others, patience in negotiation, honesty in dealing, and generosity in sharing knowledge. These were the building blocks of all successful human interaction, whether in the marketplace or in the wider world. That night, Marco dreamed of a great Tower of Babel, but instead of confusion, he saw understanding flowing between people who spoke different languages. The tower was not a monument to human pride, but a bridge connecting different cultures, and the merchants were the architects and builders of that bridge. It was a beautiful vision, one that left him with a sense of hope and purpose. Because if the language of trade could bridge the gaps between cultures, then perhaps it could also help build a world where different peoples could live together in mutual respect and cooperation. The market had given him many gifts, but perhaps the greatest was the understanding that beneath all the differences that seemed to divide people, there was a common language of human needs and desires that could form the basis for understanding and cooperation, and learning to speak that language was perhaps the most valuable skill any merchant could acquire. Chapter 9. The Eternal Market. The seasons had completed their full cycle since Marco had first begun his apprenticeship, and spring had returned to Venice with its familiar promise of renewal and possibility. But this spring felt different to Marco. charged with a significance that went beyond the usual turning of the year. The city that had been his home and classroom for so long now seemed to be preparing him for a larger role in the great drama of the world. He stood in the Rialto market on a morning that seemed to hold its breath, watching the familiar dance of commerce unfold around him. The same merchants tended the same stalls, the same customers sought the same goods, the same rhythms governed the daily life of the ancient marketplace. But Marco saw it all with new eyes, understanding now that this was not just a place of business, but a living embodiment of human cooperation and cultural exchange. Master Giovanni approached him with a letter in his hand, his expression a mixture of pride and sadness that Marco had learned to recognize. "From your father," the old merchant said simply. "It seems your family's journey is about to enter a new phase." The letter was brief but momentous. Niccolo and Maffeo Polo had been invited to the court of the great Khan in China. They were preparing for the most ambitious phase of their journey, one that would take them into the heart of the Mongol Empire and potentially establish trading relationships that could transform Venice's position in the world. "They want me to join them," Marco said softly, the reality of the invitation beginning to sink in. "They're sending a guide back to Venice to escort me to their location. In a few months, I could be following in the footsteps of the first Marco Polo, seeing the wonders of the East with my own eyes." Master Giovanni nodded, his eyes reflecting the complex emotions that Marco was feeling. "It is the opportunity of a lifetime, one that few young men ever receive, but it also means leaving behind everything you have known, everyone you love, for a journey that will take years and carries risks that we can only imagine." The decision was not an easy one. Marco thought of his mother, who had already endured long separations from her husband and brother-in-law. He thought of Sophia, whose friendship had become one of the most important relationships in his life. He thought of the market, which had become his university, his community, his home. But he also thought of the stories his father had shared, the maps he had studied, the dreams that had been growing inside him since childhood. The call of distant horizons, which had been a gentle whisper, was now becoming an insistent voice that demanded to be heard. That evening, Marco met Sophia at their usual bridge, the place where they had shared so many conversations about trade, culture, and the wider world. The spring moon was full, casting silver pathways across the water and creating an atmosphere of magic and possibility. "I've heard," Sophia said simply, her dark eyes reflecting both understanding and concern. "Your father has been offered the chance to visit the great Khan, and they want you to join them." "How did you know?" Marco asked, though he suspected that in the close-knit world of the merchant community, such news traveled quickly. "My father received word through the merchant networks," Sophia confirmed. "It's the kind of opportunity that creates ripples throughout our community. A successful mission to the great Khan's court could open new markets, establish new relationships, create possibilities that we can only imagine." They sat in their customary spot, watching the evening traffic on the canal below. A gondola carrying a group of musicians passed by, their songs creating a soundtrack that seemed to capture the bittersweet mood of the evening. "I'm torn," Marco admitted. The opportunity to see the wonders of the East, to follow in the footsteps of the great travelers, to help establish trading relationships that could benefit Venice for generations. It's everything I've dreamed of. But leaving Venice, leaving the market, leaving you. Sophia reached out and took his hand, a gesture of friendship and understanding that spoke volumes. "You have to go," she said firmly. "This is not just about your personal desires or fears. This is about your destiny as a merchant, as an adventurer, as someone who can bridge the gap between different worlds. But what about everything I've learned here? What about the relationships I've built? What about us? What you've learned here will travel with you. Sophia replied with wisdom beyond her years. The market has given you gifts that you will carry wherever you go. The understanding of trade, the appreciation of different cultures, the knowledge that commerce is about more than just profit. As for us, true friendship is not limited by distance. The relationships that matter are those that can survive separation and grow stronger through shared experiences, even if those experiences happen in different places. They talked long into the evening, exploring the implications of the decision that Marco faced. Sophia shared her own dreams of travel and adventure, her understanding that the life of a merchant's daughter in Constantinople had prepared her for a future that would likely involve journeys of her own. Perhaps, she suggested with a smile, our paths will cross again in some distant market. Perhaps I'll be in Samarkand or Baghdad when you pass through, and we can share stories of our adventures. Perhaps we'll meet again in Venice and discover that our separate journeys have made us both wiser and more understanding of the world we live in. The following weeks were a blur of preparation and farewell. Marco spent as much time as possible in the market, absorbing the lessons that Master Giovanni had to share, building relationships with merchants who might become valuable contacts in the years to come, and saying goodbye to the community that had become his extended family. Master Giovanni conducted a series of intensive lessons, sharing knowledge that went beyond the mechanics of trade to encompass the deeper wisdom that came from decades of experience. He taught Marco about the importance of cultural sensitivity, the art of building trust across cultural divides, the techniques for gathering and evaluating information in unfamiliar environments. Remember, the old merchant said during one of their final sessions, that you are not just representing yourself or your family. You are representing Venice, the merchant community, and the principles of fair trade that we have worked so hard to establish. Every action you take, every relationship you build, every transaction you conduct will reflect on all of us. He also provided Marco with letters of introduction to merchants in various cities along the route to China, men who owed favors to Master Giovanni, or who were part of the vast network of relationships that connected the trading world. These letters, he explained, are more valuable than gold. They open doors, create trust, provide access to information and assistance that might otherwise be unavailable. But they also create obligations. You must conduct yourself in a way that honors the trust that these merchants will place in you. Sophia's father also provided valuable assistance, sharing his knowledge of the political and cultural landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean, offering insights into the customs and expectations that Marco would encounter, and providing letters of his own to merchants in Constantinople and beyond. The journey you are undertaking, Master Rashid told Marco during one of their conversations, is not just a physical journey from one place to another. It is a journey of understanding, of learning to see the world through different eyes, of discovering that beneath all our differences, we share common hopes and dreams. The day of departure finally arrived. Marco's mother had prepared a feast for his farewell, inviting Master Giovanni, Sophia and her father, and several other merchants who had become important figures in Marco's life. The evening was filled with good food, fine wine, and stories that ranged from practical advice to philosophical reflections on the nature of adventure and discovery. As the evening drew to a close, Marco found himself alone with Sophia on their bridge, making their final farewell in the place where their friendship had deepened and matured over the months they had known each other. "I have something for you," Sophia said, producing a small package wrapped in silk. "A gift for your journey, something to remind you of Venice and the lessons you've learned here." Inside the package was a small compass, its face decorated with intricate patterns that suggested both Islamic and Venetian design elements. "So you can always find your way home," she explained. "No matter how far you travel, no matter how many wonders you see, this will help you remember where you came from and guide you back when your journey is complete. Marco was overwhelmed by the gesture, understanding that the gift was more than just a practical tool. It was a symbol of their friendship, their shared dreams, their mutual understanding of the calling that was taking him away from Venice. "I have something for you as well," he said, producing a small journal bound in leather that he had commissioned from one of Venice's finest bookbinders. "For your own adventures when they come. So you can record the stories, the lessons, the experiences that will make you the merchant you are destined to become." They embraced then, not as lovers parting, but as fellow adventurers acknowledging the different paths that life was offering them while affirming the bonds of friendship and understanding that would connect them regardless of distance or time. The morning of departure was clear and bright, as if Venice herself was giving Marco her blessing for the journey ahead. The guide his father had sent, an experienced merchant named Pietro, who had traveled the route to China before, was waiting at the appointed meeting place with a small but well-equipped party of travelers. Master Giovanni was there to see him off, along with Sofia and her father, Marco's mother, and a delegation of merchants who had come to wish him well and entrust him with messages for their colleagues in distant cities. "Remember," Master Giovanni said as they embraced, "that you carry with you not just goods for trade, but the reputation of Venice itself. Conduct yourself with honor, wisdom, and compassion. Seek to understand before seeking to be understood. And remember that every person you meet is a potential teacher, every experience a potential lesson." Sophia's farewell was simpler but no less meaningful. "Write to us," she said. "Share your adventures, your discoveries, your insights. Let us live vicariously through your experiences. And remember that no matter how far you travel, you have friends and colleagues here who will be waiting to welcome you home." As Marco's party made their way through the city toward the mainland, he looked back one final time at the skyline of Venice, its domes and towers creating a silhouette that had been familiar since childhood. But now he saw it not just as his home, but as a starting point, a foundation, a base from which the great adventure of his life was about to unfold. The journey to join his father and uncle would take months, crossing landscapes that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the world. He would encounter cultures that would expand his understanding of human possibility, see wonders that would exceed his wildest dreams, and face challenges that would test every skill and insight he had developed during his apprenticeship. But as Venice gradually disappeared behind him, Marco felt not fear or uncertainty, but a profound sense of rightness. This was his path, his destiny, the culmination of everything he had been learning since that first day in the Rialto market, when he had begun to understand the deeper meanings of trade and commerce. The eternal market of Venice had given him its final and greatest gift, the understanding that life itself was the ultimate trade, an exchange of experiences and insights that enriched everyone it touched. And like all great merchants, he was now ready to venture beyond the familiar, to seek new treasures in distant lands, and to bring back not just material wealth, but the more precious cargo of knowledge, understanding, and human connection. The market would continue without him, its rhythms unchanged by the departure of one young apprentice. But Marco knew that he carried within him the essence of everything it had taught him, the patience to wait for the right moment, the wisdom to understand before judging, the courage to bridge cultural divides, and the insight to see that every transaction was an opportunity to create something greater than the sum of its parts. As he faced the horizon that promised both adventure and homecoming, Marco understood that he was not just leaving Venice. He was taking Venice with him, in the form of the principles and wisdom that would guide him through whatever lay ahead. And in that understanding, he found the peace that comes from knowing that you are exactly where you are meant to be, doing exactly what you are meant to do, in the great eternal market of human experience.